September 17, 1944. The Belgian-German border, near the village of Hürtgen. Captain James Kendrick stood in a command post, a converted farmhouse basement with walls that smelled of damp earth and old potatoes. Outside, rain drummed against the small ground-level windows. Inside, maps covered a wooden table, their edges curling in the humidity. Battalion Communications Officer Lieutenant Morrison was describing the German positions. 3 kilometers east. Reinforced concrete pillboxes. Interlocking machine gun fields. Minefields confirmed by reconnaissance. Kendrick was 31 years old. A schoolteacher from Vermont before the war. He had joined the army in 1941, trained at Fort Benning, received his commission, and shipped to England in late 1943. He had been with the 28th Infantry Division through Normandy, through the liberation of Paris, through the grinding advance toward Germany. He was not a West Point graduate. He was not from a military family. He was a citizen soldier who had learned war through experience, loss, and the accumulated weight of decisions that got men killed. The battalion commander, Colonel Hartmann, wanted an attack. Simple. Direct. Take the ridgeline before nightfall. Deny the Germans observation over the valley. The operation would support the larger push toward the Siegfried Line. Every unit was advancing. Every commander was under pressure to maintain momentum. To show aggression. To demonstrate that American forces would not be stopped by concrete and wire. Kendrick had his orders. He would lead Baker Company forward at dawn. 212 men. Most were replacements who had arrived in the past 3 weeks. They had basic training. They had seen some combat. But they had not experienced what waited in the Hürtgen Forest. They had not learned that trees could kill you as efficiently as bullets. That artillery bursts in forest canopy created airbursts that shredded everything below. That visibility extended maybe 20 meters in the dense woods, turning every advance into a series of close-range ambushes. He studied the map. The route was straightforward on paper. Move through the forest. Reach the ridgeline. Establish defensive positions. Hold against counterattack. Standard infantry tactics for terrain that was anything but standard. His executive officer, Lieutenant Parsons, stood beside him. Parsons was 23. A college student when the war started. He had been with the company since D-Day. He knew the men. He knew what they could do and what they couldn't. He looked at the map and said nothing. His silence was louder than any protest. Outside, the rain continued. September in the Ardennes meant mud. It meant cold nights and wet uniforms that never dried. It meant weapons that jammed because moisture seeped into mechanisms no matter how carefully you cleaned them. It meant men who shivered through guard duty and developed trench foot and pneumonia and a dozen other ailments that reduced combat effectiveness before the first shot was fired. Kendrick had learned something during the past 4 months. He had learned that courage and stupidity often looked identical in the moment. That following orders could be the right thing or the wrong thing depending on factors no map could show. That getting men killed for no tactical gain was not courage. It was waste. He had also learned that questioning orders carried consequences. In the American Army, initiative was encouraged. Up to a point. Beyond that point, hesitation became insubordination. Caution became cowardice. And officers who failed to attack when ordered found themselves relieved, reassigned, their careers finished before their 30s. Colonel Hartmann had made the plan clear. Baker Company would attack. Charlie Company would provide support by fire from the left flank. Able Company would remain in reserve. The attack would commence at 0600. Artillery preparation would begin at 0545. 15 minutes of high explosive shells on known German positions. Then the infantry would advance. Kendrick asked about reconnaissance. Hartmann said reconnaissance had been conducted. The information was in the intelligence summary. German strength estimated at company level. Fortifications identified. Approach routes marked. Kendrick asked about the minefields. Hartmann said engineers would clear lanes. The engineers would move forward during the artillery preparation. They would mark safe paths through the obstacles. Kendrick asked about casualties. Expected losses for the operation. Hartmann looked at him for a long moment. Then said that casualties were inevitable. That war required sacrifice. That Baker Company was ready. That Captain Kendrick was ready. The meeting ended. Kendrick returned to his company area. The men were sheltered in foxholes and dugouts scattered through a grove of pine trees. They had covered their positions with logs and branches. They had built small fires despite the risk. They were trying to stay warm. Trying to dry their socks. Trying to eat cold rations because hot food drew attention. Sergeant Cooper was moving between positions. Cooper was 38 years old. A veteran of the First World War. He had enlisted again in 1942. He knew infantry combat better than any officer in the battalion. He knew when orders made sense and when they didn't. He approached Kendrick and asked about the attack. Kendrick told him. Dawn attack. Objective the ridgeline. Artillery support. Engineer support. Standard assault operation. Cooper said nothing for a moment. Then he asked if the captain had seen the terrain. Really seen it? Not on a map. Actually walked through that forest. Kendrick had not. Nobody had. The area was in German hands. Reconnaissance meant watching through binoculars from safe distance. It meant studying aerial photographs that showed tree canopy, not ground conditions. It meant relying on intelligence reports that were educated guesses. Cooper said the forest was different than what they'd fought through in Normandy. Denser. Older growth. Limited visibility. Natural funnel points where German machine guns could create killing zones. He said the Germans had been preparing these positions for months. Maybe years. They knew every meter of terrain. They had pre-registered artillery on every likely approach route. They had made that ridgeline into a fortress. Kendrick knew Cooper was right. He also knew it didn't matter. Orders were orders. The attack would happen. His job was to lead it. To minimize casualties if possible. But to take that ridgeline regardless of cost. He spent the evening with his platoon leaders. Lieutenant Hayes, 1st Platoon. Lieutenant Dixon, 2nd Platoon. Lieutenant Parsons, 3rd Platoon. He explained the plan. Showed them the map. Assigned sectors. Coordinated timing. Made sure everyone understood their role. They asked questions. Good questions. About communication in dense forest. About medical evacuation routes. About what to do if they lost radio contact. About ammunition resupply. About fallback positions if the attack failed. Kendrick answered what he could. For the rest, he told them they would adapt. That infantry combat was problem-solving under pressure. That they had trained for this. That he had confidence in them and in the men. He did not tell them what he was thinking. That this attack felt wrong. That the timing was rushed. That the intelligence was incomplete. That sending 200 men into unknown terrain against prepared positions was a recipe for disaster. At 2,300 hours, he visited the company positions one final time. The men were quiet. Some were sleeping. Others were awake, staring into the darkness. A few were writing letters. Final letters. Just in case. The kind of letters soldiers write before operations they might not survive. He spoke to them briefly. Told them to get rest. Told them to check their equipment. Told them they would move out at 0530. That artillery would support them. That they would take that ridgeline and deny it to the Germans. They listened. Some nodded. Others showed no expression. They had learned that officers' speeches rarely matched the reality of combat. That confidence expressed in the rear didn't stop bullets in the forest. Kendrick returned to his position. A foxhole near the company command post. He sat in the darkness, listening to rain. To distant artillery. To the sounds of 200 men preparing for an attack that might kill half of them before noon. He thought about his wife. About his students back in Vermont. About the classroom where he had taught history. The irony was not lost on him. He had taught about military campaigns. About tactical decisions. About generals and battles and the consequences of courage and cowardice. Now he was living it. Making decisions that would be studied or forgotten depending on how many men died tomorrow. The rain stopped near midnight. The clouds cleared. Temperature dropped. He could see stars through gaps in the forest canopy. The same stars that had been there when Caesar's legions marched. When Napoleon's armies fought. When his own father had served in the trenches of the First World War. The stars didn't care about tactical decisions or courage or whether men lived or died pursuing objectives on maps. He did not sleep. He watched the darkness slowly give way to gray pre-dawn light. He watched his men begin to stir. To prepare weapons. To eat final rations. To help each other with equipment. To share cigarettes and quiet words. At 0530, Baker Company assembled. 212 men in 4 columns. They moved forward through the forest. Silent. Disciplined. Each man spacing himself from the one ahead. Each man carrying 60 pounds of equipment, ammunition, water, and the knowledge that some of them would not return. The artillery preparation began at 0545. 15 minutes of shells screaming overhead. Explosions in the distance. Trees splintering. The ground trembling. Then silence. The kind of silence that follows artillery. The kind that precedes infantry assault. At 0600, Kendrick gave the order. Baker Company advanced toward the ridgeline. Toward the German positions. Toward a day that would define his career and haunt his conscience for the rest of his life. The forest swallowed them within minutes. Visibility dropped to 15 meters. Thick undergrowth. Ancient trees with trunks wide enough to hide behind. The ground was soft from rain. Boots sank into mud with each step. The men moved in tactical formation. Fire teams alternating advance. Cover and movement. The procedures they had drilled became automatic. Nobody spoke. Hand signals only. They covered 400 meters in 20 minutes. No contact. No German fire. The silence was unnatural. After an artillery bombardment, there should have been something. Wounded men calling for help. Survivors repositioning. Machine gun teams adjusting their fields of fire. Instead, nothing. Kendrick moved with 2nd Platoon in the center of the advance. Lieutenant Dixon beside him. Radio operator Private Thompson carrying the backpack radio that maintained contact with Battalion. The radio crackled occasionally. Static. Atmospheric interference. The forest canopy disrupted radio signals. Communication was intermittent at best. At 700 meters, they found the first signs. Fresh dirt. Disturbed earth. Sergeant Cooper, walking point with 1st Platoon, raised his fist. Halt signal. Everyone froze. Cooper knelt. Examined the ground. Then looked back at Kendrick and made a different signal. Mines. The engineers were supposed to have cleared lanes. That was the plan. Artillery would suppress German positions. Engineers would move forward during the barrage. They would locate and mark safe paths through the minefields. Infantry would follow the marked routes. There were no engineers. There were no marked routes. There was only disturbed earth and the certainty that German teller mines were buried under that soil. Step on one, it would detonate. 300 grams of TNT designed to destroy tank treads. It would vaporize a human leg. The explosion would alert every German position in the area. And then the machine guns would open fire. Kendrick called Lieutenant Hayes forward. 1st Platoon would have to navigate around the minefield. Find a route that avoided the obvious approaches. It would take time. It would break the attack's momentum. But there was no choice. Hayes deployed his men in a wide arc. They moved slowly. Probing the ground. Looking for more disturbed earth. For tripwires. For any indication of German defenses. Progress slowed to a crawl. 10 meters every 5 minutes. Each step deliberate. Each movement calculated. At 0635, the machine gun fire started. Not from the front. From the flanks. 2 machine gun positions, one left, one right. Positioned to create crossfire on anyone trying to bypass the minefield. The Germans had anticipated the American response. They had prepared for exactly this scenario. Private Williams, 1st Platoon, was hit in the first burst. Chest wounds. He went down without a sound. Corporal Jensen tried to reach him. Second burst caught Jensen in the legs. He fell. Started screaming. The screaming would draw more fire. Kendrick ordered 2nd Platoon to suppress the left machine gun. 3rd Platoon would engage the right. 1st Platoon would pull back to cover. They needed to establish a base of fire. To locate the German positions precisely. To coordinate an assault that could eliminate the machine guns without losing more men. The forest erupted. American M1 rifles firing 8-round clips. Browning automatic rifles spraying 20-round bursts. The sound was overwhelming. Echoing through trees. Impossible to locate exact source directions. The Germans responded. 2 machine guns became 3. Then 4. They had established a defensive belt. Multiple positions with interlocking fields of fire. Lieutenant Dixon went down at 0642. Took a round through the shoulder. Parsons moved forward to take command of 2nd Platoon. Kendrick stayed with the company command post, trying to maintain control. Trying to understand the tactical situation. The map showed German positions on the ridgeline. It didn't show these defensive positions. These were secondary positions. Designed to slow and disrupt any American advance. To channel attackers into kill zones. Sergeant Cooper reached Kendrick's position. He had pulled 1st Platoon back 50 meters. They had taken cover behind fallen logs and in small depressions. 3 men dead. 7 wounded. The platoon was combat ineffective. Cooper said they needed to withdraw. To reorganize. To request artillery support on the German positions before trying again. Kendrick agreed. He raised Battalion on the radio. Requested fire mission. Gave grid coordinates for the German machine guns. Colonel Hartmann's response was immediate. Negative. Artillery was allocated to support other battalion attacks. Baker Company would continue the assault with organic weapons. Use mortars. Use rifle grenades. Suppress the German positions and advance. Kendrick tried again. Explained the situation. Multiple machine guns. Minefields. Casualties mounting. The attack was stalled. He needed either artillery support or permission to withdraw and develop a new plan. Hartmann's response was cold. Baker Company would continue the attack. Those were the orders. The ridgeline had to be taken. If Captain Kendrick was unable to lead the assault, he should turn command over to his executive officer and report to battalion headquarters. The transmission ended. Kendrick stood in the forest, holding the radio handset. Around him, men were dying. Machine gun fire continued. The wounded were calling for medics. The company medics were trying to reach casualties under fire. It was 0650. The attack had been underway for 50 minutes. They had advanced 700 meters and lost 15 men. The objective was still 2 kilometers away through fortified terrain. He had a choice. Continue the attack as ordered. Push through the machine gun positions. Accept additional casualties. Try to reach the ridgeline before German reinforcements arrived. That was the military decision. The obedient decision. The decision that followed the chain of command and maintained the operation's momentum. Or he could make a different choice. Lieutenant Parsons reached the command post. His uniform was torn. Blood on his sleeve from a grazing wound. He had been forward with 2nd Platoon. He described what he had seen. The German defenses were extensive. Not just machine guns. Mortars. Prepared positions with overhead cover. Fields of fire that overlapped. Any frontal assault would be slaughtered. Kendrick asked about flanking routes. Parsons shook his head. The terrain funneled all approaches through narrow corridors. The Germans had chosen this ground carefully. They had spent months preparing it. Bunkers. Trenches. Communication lines. This wasn't a hasty defense. It was a fortress. Sergeant Cooper added his assessment. The intelligence had been wrong. Not slightly wrong. Completely wrong. What they faced wasn't a company-level position. It was at least a battalion. Maybe more. Reinforced concrete. Heavy weapons. Coordinated fires. Taking this position would require a full regiment with armor support and sustained artillery preparation. A single company had no chance. At 0705, a German mortar barrage began. They had identified Baker Company's positions. The rounds fell with precision. Timed fuses. Airbursts in the tree canopy. Shrapnel rained down. No overhead cover. The men pressed themselves into the earth. Some were hit. Others survived by chance. By being in a slightly deeper depression. By being behind a thicker tree trunk. The barrage lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, Kendrick counted 8 more casualties. 5 dead. 3 wounded. His company had been reduced to 189 effective soldiers in just over an hour of combat. They had not reached the objective. They had not even seriously engaged the main German defenses. He made his decision. He called Parsons and Cooper together. Told them to prepare withdrawal. 1 platoon would establish rear guard. The other 2 would pull back by bounds. They would return to the starting positions. They would take their wounded. They would recover bodies if possible. They would disengage from contact and consolidate. Parsons stared at him. Cooper showed no expression. Both understood what this meant. Withdrawing without permission was insubordination. Refusing to continue the attack was disobeying a direct order. In combat. Under fire. Kendrick would be relieved. Probably court-martialed. His career was finished. His reputation destroyed. He told them to execute the withdrawal. They moved. The extraction took 90 minutes. Careful. Controlled. 3rd platoon maintained covering fire while 1st and 2nd pulled back. Then 3rd withdrew under cover from the other platoons. They carried wounded men. They recovered dog tags from the dead they could reach. They left 13 bodies behind. 13 men who would remain in that forest until the war ended. Maybe longer. By 0845, Baker Company had returned to their starting positions. 189 men. 31 casualties. 0 ground gained. Mission failed. Kendrick reported to Colonel Hartmann at 0900. The battalion commander was furious. The attack had been ordered. The attack had failed. Other units were advancing. Other companies were taking their objectives. Only Baker Company had withdrawn. Only Captain Kendrick had refused to continue the assault. Hartmann relieved him on the spot. Effective immediately. Lieutenant Parsons would assume command of Baker Company. Captain Kendrick would remain with battalion headquarters pending investigation. Charges would be filed. The division commander would be informed. Kendrick handed over his maps and orders. He walked to the rear. Alone. Past men who wouldn't look at him. Past officers who had heard what happened. He had retreated. He had abandoned the mission. He had proven himself unfit for command. The word spread quickly through the battalion. Through the regiment. Through the division. Captain Kendrick. The schoolteacher from Vermont. The officer who lost his nerve. The coward who retreated rather than pressed the attack. At 1,400 hours, Able Company launched their attack on the same objective. Captain Morrison commanded Able Company. West Point graduate. Class of 1940. He had spent 4 years learning military tactics and leadership. He had studied Clausewitz and Jomini and the great campaigns of history. He understood that success required aggressive action. That hesitation invited disaster. That commanders must lead from the front and inspire their men through personal courage. Colonel Hartmann had briefed him personally. Baker Company's failure had been a command failure. The German defenses were not as strong as Captain Kendrick had reported. The terrain was difficult but not impossible. A determined assault would succeed where timidity had failed. Able Company consisted of 228 men. All trained. All equipped. All ready to prove that American infantry could overcome any German defensive position through firepower and determination. They moved forward at 14:30. Artillery preparation identical to Baker companies. 15 minutes of high explosive on known German positions. Then the infantry advanced. The initial phase went well. They covered the first 400 meters without contact. They found the minefield. Engineers had finally arrived. They began clearing lanes, marking safe paths with white tape. The work was slow but methodical. At 15:15, German machine guns opened fire. The same positions that had engaged Baker Company. Multiple guns creating interlocking fields of fire. Able Company went to ground. Began suppression. Tried to maneuver around the flanks. The result was identical to Baker Company's experience. Men hit crossing open areas. Casualties mounting. Progress measured in meters. Machine gun positions that seemed to multiply. Every advance met with fire from unexpected directions. Captain Morrison requested artillery support at 15:30. Hartmann approved. Fire mission conducted. Shells landed on suspected German positions. When the barrage lifted, Able Company advanced again. The Germans had withdrawn into bunkers during the artillery. When the infantry came forward, they emerged and resumed firing. Machine guns. Mortars. Rifle fire from prepared positions. Able Company took heavy casualties. First platoon was reduced to 30 men within 20 minutes. Morrison ordered a frontal assault at 1600. Fix bayonets. Move forward under covering fire. Close with the enemy. Destroy the positions. The men tried. They advanced into a storm of fire. 15 were killed in the first 50 meters. 30 more were wounded. The assault broke. The survivors fell back. At 16:30, German forces counterattacked. Not just defending. Advancing. Infantry supported by mortar fire. They had been waiting for the American attack to exhaust itself. Now they moved forward to destroy the weakened company. Able Company disintegrated. Men ran. Command and control collapsed. Morrison tried to rally them. A mortar round killed him and his radio operator. Lieutenant Wade assumed command. He ordered withdrawal. Not organized withdrawal. Rout. The men fled back through the forest. Abandoning wounded. Abandoning equipment. Desperate to escape the German assault. The pursuit lasted 30 minutes. German infantry followed the fleeing Americans. Shooting. Capturing. When it ended, Able Company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of 228 men, 97 were dead or missing. 63 were wounded. Only 68 returned to American lines. And many of those were in shock. Unable to function. They had experienced something beyond their training. Beyond their psychological capacity to process. Colonel Hartmann received the reports at 17:30. He immediately ordered Charlie Company to rescue Able Company survivors. To recover wounded. To establish a defensive line and prevent further German penetration. Charlie Company advanced cautiously. Captain Williams had heard about Baker and Able Companies. He had no intention of repeating their fate. He moved slowly. Established strong base of fire positions. Coordinated with available artillery. By 1900, he had recovered 60 wounded men and established a defensive perimeter. The cost had been catastrophic. 2 companies destroyed. 124 dead or missing. 94 wounded. No objective taken. No tactical advantage gained. The Germans remained on the ridgeline. Their defensive positions intact. Their confidence reinforced. At 2100, the division commander, Major General Harrison, arrived at battalion headquarters. Hartmann had to explain the disaster. Had to account for how a simple assault operation had become a massacre. Had to justify why his battalion had suffered 40% casualties in a single day. Harrison reviewed the reports. Studied the maps. Talked to surviving officers. Then he made his decision. The attack was suspended. The ridgeline would be bypassed. Division artillery would pound the German positions continuously for the next week. Then, if necessary, a full regimental assault with armor support would be considered. But no more company-level attacks. No more frontal assaults into prepared defenses. Harrison also reviewed Captain Kendrick's actions. He read Kendrick's report. Talked to Lieutenant Parsons and Sergeant Cooper. Examined the intelligence that had been available before the attack. His conclusion was immediate. Kendrick had been correct. The intelligence had been inadequate. The attack plan had been flawed. The German defenses were far stronger than estimated. Continuing the assault after making contact would have resulted in Baker Company suffering the same fate as Able Company. By withdrawing, Kendrick had saved 189 men. Harrison ordered Kendrick reinstated to command. The charges were dropped. Colonel Hartmann was reassigned to division staff. A new battalion commander was appointed. One who understood that tactical judgment sometimes required rejecting impossible orders. But the damage to Kendrick's reputation was done. The story had spread. He had retreated. He had disobeyed orders. That was the version most soldiers heard. The nuance. The tactical wisdom. The lives saved. That didn't make for good barracks conversation. Kendrick returned to Baker Company on September 20th. 3 days after the battle. The men received him quietly. Some with respect. Understanding he had saved them. Others with suspicion. Wondering if he would retreat again when they needed him to fight. The battalion remained in defensive positions through September and into October. They conducted patrols. They improved their positions. They endured German artillery and occasional probes. But they did not attack the ridgeline. In late October, after 2 weeks of sustained artillery bombardment, a full divisional attack was launched. 3 regiments. Tank support. Air strikes. Artillery preparation that lasted 8 hours. The attack succeeded. The ridgeline was taken. German forces withdrew to secondary positions. The operation cost the division 230 dead. 480 wounded. The objective that Baker Company had been ordered to take with 200 men required 3,000 men and massive fire support. Kendrick learned this and said nothing. He had been right. His tactical judgment had been correct. His decision to withdraw had saved his company. But being right didn't restore his reputation. Didn't erase the word that followed him. Coward. The war continued. Baker Company fought through the Hürtgen Forest. Through the Battle of the Bulge. Across the Rhine. Into Germany. Kendrick remained their commander. He led them competently. Carefully. He took calculated risks when necessary. But he never sacrificed men for objectives that couldn't be achieved. His approach created results. Baker Company maintained high combat effectiveness through the rest of the war. Their casualty rate was lower than comparable units. They completed their missions. They earned unit citations. But James Kendrick never received personal recognition. No medals for valor. No promotion. The retreat had defined him. In April 1945, as the war in Europe approached its end, Sergeant Cooper spoke to him. They were in a German village. Waiting for orders. Cooper had been with Kendrick since Normandy. He had seen everything. He understood what the captain had endured. Cooper told him something. After the September 17th battle, after Able Company was destroyed, he had talked to survivors. Asked them questions. Most couldn't talk about it coherently. But a few described the German positions. The bunkers. The interlocking fires. The mortars. Everything Kendrick had reported. Cooper had also talked to the engineers who finally cleared the minefields. They confirmed heavy mining. Anti-personnel mines mixed with anti-tank mines. Booby traps. The approaches were designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Anyone advancing through that terrain without engineer support and heavy artillery would have been slaughtered. He told Kendrick that Baker Company understood. They knew their captain had saved them. They respected him for it. More than they respected officers who got men killed trying to prove their courage. Kendrick thanked him. But he knew the sergeant's opinion, though valued, didn't change the broader perception. In the American Army of 1945, aggressive commanders were celebrated. Cautious commanders were suspect. He had been cautious. He had retreated. That was his legacy. The war ended in May. Kendrick remained with occupation forces until September. Then he went home. Back to Vermont. Back to teaching. He returned to his classroom. To students who knew nothing about the Hürtgen Forest. About impossible orders. About choosing between obedience and preserving lives. He taught history. But he didn't talk about his war. When students asked, he gave brief answers. Yes, he had served. Yes, he had seen combat. No, he didn't want to discuss it in detail. The past was past. Joanne Kendrick, his wife, knew something had happened. Something beyond normal combat trauma. He would wake from nightmares. September 17th dreams. Hearing machine gun fire. Seeing able companies dead. Wondering if he had made the right choice. Wondering if his withdrawal had encouraged Colonel Hartmann to send another company into the same trap. She tried to help. He appreciated the effort. But some burdens couldn't be shared. Some decisions remained alone in the conscience of the man who made them. In 1952, he attended a division reunion. Men from the 28th Infantry Division. Officers and enlisted. They gathered in Philadelphia. Shared stories. Renewed bonds. Kendrick almost didn't go. But Joanne insisted. Said he needed to reconnect. To see his men. Baker Company veterans were there. Parsons. Cooper. Hayes. Others who had survived the war. They greeted him warmly. Bought him drinks. Told stories about operations they had conducted together. They treated him with respect. With affection. One evening, Lieutenant Parsons, now a civilian lawyer, pulled him aside. Told him something he had never mentioned before. After the war, Parsons had accessed the division records. Read the after-action reports. Studied the casualty statistics. He showed Kendrick the numbers. Baker Company casualties from September 1944 to May 1945, 68 dead, 147 wounded. Able Company, which had been rebuilt after September 17, 112 dead, 203 wounded. Charlie Company, 96 dead, 181 wounded. Baker Company's survival rate was highest in the battalion. Significantly higher. The difference correlated directly to command decisions. To tactical judgment. To a commander who valued his men's lives above personal reputation. Parsons told him that every Baker Company veteran understood this. They knew what September 17 had cost Kendrick professionally. They knew he had sacrificed his career to save them. They respected him for it. More than any citation or medal could express. Kendrick listened. Thanked him. But the validation, though meaningful, didn't erase the memory. The word coward had been spoken. In reports. In conversations. In the judgment of officers who hadn't been there. Who hadn't seen the German defenses. Who hadn't faced the choice between obedience and survival. He returned to Vermont. To teaching. To a quiet life. He never spoke publicly about the war. Never wrote memoirs. Never sought recognition. In 1978, a military historian researching the Hürtgen Forest campaign discovered Kendrick's story. Found the reports about September 17, found the casualty statistics. Found witnesses who described what happened. The historian wanted to interview Kendrick. To document his decision. To present it as a case study in tactical judgment under pressure. Kendrick declined. Politely. Firmly. He said the past was past. That his decisions had been made. That he had lived with the consequences. He didn't need analysis or vindication. The historian respected his wishes. But he published the research anyway. Without direct quotes from Kendrick. Just the facts. The orders. The terrain. The casualties. The outcome. The article appeared in a military journal. Few people read it. But those who did understood something. That courage in war wasn't always about attacking. Sometimes it was about having the strength to retreat. To refuse impossible orders. To choose men's lives over personal ambition. James Kendrick died in 1989. Age 76. Heart failure. His funeral was well attended. Former students. Community members. And a group of elderly men who traveled from different states. Baker Company veterans. They came to honor their captain. The man who saved them by making the hardest choice a commander could make. They didn't speak at the funeral. Didn't give eulogies. They just stood together. A final formation. Paying respects to an officer who valued their lives above his reputation. After the service, Sergeant Cooper, now 87 years old, spoke briefly to Kendrick's son. Told him something. That his father had been the best combat commander Cooper had served under. Not because he was aggressive. Not because he was fearless. Because he was wise. Because he understood that getting men killed for no purpose wasn't leadership. It was failure. The son listened. Didn't fully understand. He had heard his father's stories. Brief mentions of the war. Nothing detailed. He knew there had been some controversy. Some difficult decision. But his father had never explained it. Cooper explained it. Told him about September 17th. About the impossible orders. About the retreat. About Able Company's destruction. About 189 men who came home because one captain had the courage to disobey. He told him that history would probably forget James Kendrick. That there would be no monuments. No medals. No formal recognition. But Baker Company veterans would remember. They would pass the story to their children. Their grandchildren. The story of a schoolteacher from Vermont who became a captain in the American Army and chose wisely when it mattered most. In the military archives, the September 17, 1944 action at Hürtgen remains documented. Reports. Casualty lists. Radio transcripts. Maps with red marks showing German positions that intelligence had failed to identify. The records are there for anyone who wants to find them. They show that Captain James Kendrick withdrew Baker Company after 1 hour of combat. That he disobeyed orders to continue the assault. That he was temporarily relieved of command. They also show that the subsequent attack by Able Company resulted in catastrophic casualties. That the objective required divisional-level forces to capture. That tactical judgment, not cowardice, motivated the withdrawal. But records don't create reputations. Stories do. And the story most people heard was simpler. An officer who retreated. Who lost his nerve. Who failed to press the attack. That story survived because it was easier to tell. Easier to understand. Easier to use as a cautionary tale about the importance of aggressive leadership. The truth was more complex. More difficult. More human. It involved a man forced to choose between conflicting values. Between obedience to authority and responsibility to subordinates. Between following orders and exercising judgment. Between reputation and conscience. James Kendrick made his choice. He lived with it. He never complained. Never sought vindication. He taught school. Raised his family. Lived a quiet life. And he carried with him, every day until he died, the knowledge that 189 men came home because he had the courage to be called a coward. That is not the kind of courage that receives medals. It is not the kind celebrated in ceremonies. It is the quiet courage of judgment. Of choosing right over easy. Of valuing lives over glory. September 17, 1944. A captain made a decision. The decision saved his men. It cost him his reputation. And in the space between those two facts lies a truth about leadership that no military manual can adequately express. Sometimes the bravest thing a commander can do is refuse to fight.